The first message arrived on a Tuesday morning, bleeding through every digital display on Earth simultaneously. The mathematical equations scrolled across screens like falling rain, their meaning incomprehensible yet somehow urgent. Dr. Rebecca Nash stood in Times Square, her coffee forgotten in her hand, watching as the same patterns repeated on the towering billboards above. "It's beautiful," she whispered, already beginning to see the patterns within patterns. As one of the leading researchers in cognitive evolution at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, she recognized something in those flowing symbols that made her heart race. This was no random cosmic noise. It was a language written in pure mathematics. Within hours, similar reports flooded in from every corner of the globe. The message penetrated every system, every network, yet caused no disruption. It simply displayed itself again and again, like a patient teacher waiting for its students to understand. The second message came 24 hours later. This time, it was accompanied by visual contact. They called themselves the Galactic Council, though the translation didn't quite capture the depth of their true name. Their representatives appeared on Earth's screens as shifting geometric patterns that somehow conveyed more emotion than any human face. Their first words were not of greeting, but of warning. "Your species stands at the precipice." The patterns shifted, creating meaning that universal translators struggle to capture. "We have watched your cognitive evolution with growing concern. You are approaching the barrier." In the hastily assembled United Nations emergency session, Dr. Nash found herself thrust into the role of humanity's representative. She stood before the assembled nations, the alien equations still dancing in her mind. "The mathematics they've shared," she explained, her voice steady despite the weight of the moment, "describes a universal theory of consciousness. It shows that there are natural laws governing the evolution of thought itself. And according to their calculations, we're approaching a critical threshold." The murmurs in the assembly grew louder. On the massive screen behind her, one of the council's representatives shifted into a pattern that radiated what could only be described as deep concern. "Every species that has reached this point has faced the same choice," the alien consciousness conveyed. "Accept the implementation of cognitive dampeners, or face the consequences of breaching the universal barrier. No species has ever survived the latter choice." Dr. Nash's hands trembled as she reviewed the proof again. The mathematics was perfect, beautiful in its complexity yet undeniable in its conclusion. It showed with absolute certainty that there was a ceiling to cognitive evolution, a point beyond which no known species had ever progressed. But something else in the equations caught her eye, a familiar pattern, like an echo of something she'd seen in her own research. "What happens?" she asked, her voice cutting through the tense silence. "What exactly happens to species that breach the barrier?" The geometric pattern shifted to something dark and complex. "They end, not just their civilizations, but their entire species. The mathematics predicts it with perfect accuracy. We have witnessed it 17 times in our history as watchers." The assembly erupted in chaos, but Dr. Nash barely heard them. Her mind was racing, following a trail through the equations that the council had presented. There was something there, something just at the edge of her understanding. As she stared at the shifting patterns of the council representative, a thought struck her that would change the course of human history. The mathematics might be perfect, but mathematics worked with given parameters, and someone had to define those parameters first. The warning had been delivered, but in that moment, standing before the United Nations, with alien mathematics swimming through her mind, Dr. Rebecca Nash made a decision that would echo through the ages. She would not let fear of the unknown limit human potential. She had no way of knowing that her next words would split humanity into two opposing camps, setting the stage for the greatest challenge our species had ever faced. "We need to look deeper," she announced, her voice carrying the weight of destiny. "The question isn't whether we should stop at their barrier. The question is, what makes them so sure it's really a barrier at all? 3 months after the warning, the streets of Boston burned. Dr. Nash watched from her laboratory window as protesters clashed outside the Cognitive Research Center. Signs reading "Accept the limits" battled against others proclaiming humanity has no ceiling. The air filled with tear gas as police tried to separate the warring factions. "They're getting bolder," said James Morrison, her research partner, looking up from a terminal displaying neural scan data. "Did you see the news from Singapore? They've already started installing the dampening fields." Rebecca pulled herself away from the window. The data on her own screen showed something the protesters below couldn't begin to understand. The first signs of change were already appearing in the population, subtle shifts in neural architecture that defied the council's predictions. "The dampeners won't stop it," she said, pulling up a three-dimensional model of human brain activity. "Look at these patterns. We're not just approaching their barrier. We're already moving through it, just not in the way they expected." A crash from below made them both jump. The protests were getting closer to the building. The division had started small. Nations initially united in their response to the Council's warning, but unity crumbled as the first research results emerged. Some countries, led by a coalition of Eastern European and Asian nations, immediately began implementing the Council's dampening technology. They called themselves the Limiters, claiming they were saving humanity from its own reckless ambition. Others, like the United States and a coalition of progressive nations, refused. These self-proclaimed climbers argued that accepting artificial limitations on human potential was a form of species-wide suicide. Dr. Nash, a graduate student, burst into the lab, breathless. "You need to see this. It's about the children." The data on the student's tablet made Rebecca's heart skip. In climber territories, children under 10 were showing cognitive development that should have been impossible. Their minds were growing in ways that completely ignored the Council's mathematical limits. "They're adapting," James whispered, looking over her shoulder. "The kids don't know they're supposed to be limited, so they're just breaking through." An alert flashed across their screens. Another nation had fallen to the limiters. Brazil's government had collapsed under pressure from pro-dampening protests, and the new emergency council's first act was to begin construction of dampening towers. "We're running out of time," Rebecca said, making a decision. "Upload everything to the secure network, all of it. If they take this facility, we can't let this data die here." James hesitated. "The council said." "The council said we'd hit a wall and die," Rebecca cut him off. "But look at these numbers. The children are proving them wrong. We're not hitting their wall because we're not taking their path. Human consciousness isn't following their rules." The building shook as something exploded outside. Through the window, they could see police lines breaking as the crowd surged forward. "It's done," the graduate student announced, finishing the upload. "But where will you go?" Rebecca smiled, already deleting the local drives. "Underground. The limiters can have their dampeners and their fear. We're going to keep climbing." As if in response to her words, a new alert lit up their screens. This one from a secret facility in the Rocky Mountains. The message was brief, but changed everything. First successful enhancement achieved. Subject shows no signs of barrier effect. We were right. The sound of breaking glass from below told them time had run out. As security alarms began to wail, Rebecca Nash made her choice. She'd started this division with her questions about the Council's warning. Now she would see it through to the end. "The truth is," she said, gathering her essential research materials, "we're not ignoring their warning anymore. We're proving it wrong. And that's what terrifies them the most." The future of human consciousness would not be decided in this lab, or by the protesters below, or even by the Galactic Council's mathematics. It would be decided by those who dared to question the very nature of their limitations. As the chaos erupted below, humanity's path forward split in two: those who accepted the known, and those who dared to reach for the impossible. Dr. Amanda Mitchell had not seen the sun in 3 months. The underground facility beneath the Rockies, known only as the Burrow to its inhabitants, had become both haven and prison for the remaining climber scientists. The constant hum of generators and recycled air had become her new normal, along with the weight of knowing that their work here could either save humanity or doom it. Running Simulation 17, her assistant called out from the other side of the lab. The holographic display sparked to life, showing neural pathway formations that would have been impossible according to the Council's mathematics. Amanda watched the patterns form, her eyes catching something she'd missed in previous runs. "Wait," she said, standing up so quickly her chair rolled away. Freeze frame at Mark 7.3. The image stopped, showing a complex web of neural connections that somehow reminded her of the Council's geometric communications. But there was something different here, something uniquely human. "They're proof," she muttered, more to herself than anyone else. They based it all on their own evolution, their own path. Her fingers flew across the interface, pulling up the Council's original warning alongside their current data. The breakthrough hit her like a physical force. "Get Dr. Nash on the secure line," she ordered, her voice trembling with excitement. Now. The connection took nearly an hour to establish. Security protocols had become essential since the limiter forces had started actively hunting down climber research facilities. Rebecca Nash's hologram appeared, looking more tired than Amanda remembered. "This better be good, Mitchell. We lost 2 more labs yesterday." "It's better than good," Amanda said, sending through her data package. "The Council's proof is based on a fundamental assumption we all missed. They think consciousness can only evolve along one path because that's how it happened for them." Understanding dawned on Rebecca's face as she reviewed the data. But human consciousness. Exactly. We evolved under completely different conditions. Our neural architecture isn't just different. It's taking paths their mathematics doesn't even account for. The discovery spread through the underground network of climber facilities like wildfire. Humanity wasn't defying universal laws. They were operating outside the Council's limited understanding of those laws. But the breakthrough came with its own price. As Amanda dug deeper into the data, she found something that made her blood run cold. The Council's warning wasn't just about protecting species from a natural barrier. It was about maintaining control over the known paths of evolution. "They're scared," she explained to the emergency meeting of climber leadership. "Not of us hitting their barrier, but of us finding a way around it. Their entire galactic structure is built on the assumption that their path is the only path." The implications were staggering. Every species that had accepted the dampeners had unknowingly submitted to having their evolution guided along the Council's approved path. Before she could present her full findings, the facility's alarms began to scream. Limiter forces had found them. "Upload everything," Amanda ordered, her team already moving with practiced efficiency. "Full encryption, maximum distribution. They can't be allowed to stop this." As security teams rushed to their positions, Amanda made one final database entry. "To whoever finds this, the Council's barrier is real, but it's not natural. It's a cage, built from mathematics and fear. Human minds are already finding ways through it, around it, beyond it. We're not breaking universal laws. We're breaking free of artificial constraints. The next stage of human evolution isn't just possible. It's already beginning, and that's what they've been afraid of all along." The sound of explosions echoed through the facility's upper levels, but Amanda Mitchell smiled as she hit the final upload button. The truth was out now, spreading through networks the limiters couldn't control, to places the Council couldn't reach. Humanity's first real breakthrough wasn't about breaking the rules. It was about discovering that the rules had been a lie all along. The enhancement chamber hummed with energy as Dr. Marcus Reynolds watched another volunteer step inside. This was the 17th attempt this week, and the weight of the previous failures hung heavy in the underground facility's recycled air. Beginning neural reconstruction, called out his lead technician, Emma Winters. Her fingers danced across the holographic controls, initiating the sequence they'd refined through heartbreak and loss. Subject's baseline holding steady. Marcus gripped the edge of his console, unable to look away from the chamber's observation window. Inside, the volunteer, a former quantum physicist named David Chen, remained perfectly still as the enhancement field built around him. The first warning sign came 3 minutes in. Neural patterns destabilizing, Emma reported, her voice tight. It's following the same cascade as the others. Marcus leaned forward, noticing something different in the data stream. Wait, he said, look at the theta wave patterns. They're not breaking down like before. The chamber's interior filled with a soft blue light as David's neural activity spiked beyond their instrument's ability to measure. Then, unlike the previous attempts, it stabilized. That's impossible, Emma whispered, checking and rechecking her readings. He's pushing past the traditional breakdown point, but his pattern integrity it's actually improving. The success was short-lived. 40 seconds later, David's mind shattered like all the others. As medical teams rushed to extract him, Marcus slumped in his chair, adding another name to his mental list of failures. But something about this attempt nagged at him. Something in those brief moments of stability. Dr. Reynolds, a young researcher, burst into the control room. You need to see this. It's about the children's wing. The facility's children's wing had been established to study the unprecedented development in young minds that Dr. Mitchell had discovered before her facility was raided. What Marcus saw there changed everything. 10-year-old Sophie Taylor sat in the center of the observation room, building impossible structures with standard building blocks. Impossible because they defied known physics, yet somehow remained stable. She's never been enhanced, the researcher explained, but look at her neural scans. Marcus stared at the readings in disbelief. Sophie's mind was operating beyond the council's barrier, but in a way completely different from their enhancement attempts. We've been going about this all wrong, he realized. We've been trying to force evolution along the paths we understand, the ones the council warned us about. But the children, they're finding their own ways through. He rushed back to the lab, calling an emergency meeting of the research team. As they reviewed the data from both David's partial success and Sophie's natural development, a pattern emerged. The adult mind tries to follow known paths, Marcus explained, projecting the comparative analysis. Even when we think we're breaking free, we're still following patterns we understand. But the children, having never been taught these limitations, they make their own paths, Emma finished, understanding dawning in her eyes. The discovery led to a complete overhaul of their enhancement protocols. Instead of trying to push human consciousness past the barrier, they began working to help it find its own way around. 2 weeks later, they made their first successful enhancement. The subject was a young graduate student who had never studied the council's mathematics, never internalized their limitations. But success brought new challenges. The council's representatives, silent since their initial warning, suddenly demanded access to all research facilities, claiming a need to protect universal constants. As Marcus prepared to transfer their research to a new secure location, he made one final log entry. The price of progress isn't in breaking through barriers. It's in learning to see that many of those barriers only existed in our minds. The children showed us that. Sometimes, the greatest obstacle to evolution isn't our limitations, but our certainty about what those limitations are. Behind him, Sophie continued building her impossible structures, each one a testament to what human minds could achieve when they simply didn't know they couldn't. Jackson Hayes had always been good at reading between the lines, As a junior diplomat assigned to the Council's lower chamber, he'd made an art of noticing what wasn't said. But even he wasn't prepared for what he found in the restricted archives. The Council's chamber was beautiful in its alien way, all shifting geometric patterns and impossible angles. Hayes walked through its crystalline corridors, his diplomatic credentials getting him past security checkpoints that would have stopped others. His target was the lesser archives, where the Council kept records of their protective interventions. Another late night, Diplomat Hayes. The geometric pattern of a Council lesser guard rippled in what he'd learned to recognize as their version of amusement. Just following up on some historical precedents, he replied, the practiced lie coming easily. The truth was far darker. 3 days ago, he'd found a reference to something called the Ascension Purge in a corrupted data stream. Now he couldn't let it go. The archives responded to his presence, holographic displays springing to life around him. He'd discovered that the Council's security systems had a blind spot. They never considered that someone might cross-reference their intervention records with their mathematical proofs. "Show me species that reached the barrier before Earth," he commanded. The display filled with data, dozens of species, all marked as successfully protected through implementation of cognitive dampening. But there were gaps in the records, careful omissions that drew his trained eye. Hayes started correlating dates, cross-referencing events. A pattern emerged that made his blood run cold. The Gyrans, a species from the Outer Rim, had questioned the barrier. They'd vanished from records shortly after. The official story said they'd chosen isolation, but Hayes found military deployment orders from that same period. The Nexus, silicon-based intelligences who'd proposed alternative evolutionary paths. Their star system was now listed as naturally uninhabitable. Species after species, all who dared to question the Council's mathematics, had been protected into submission or oblivion. Quite the late-night reading. Hayes spun around. The senior Council member hung in the air, its geometric pattern more complex than any he'd seen before. "I was just looking for the truth." The pattern shifted, showing what might have been amusement or threat. "And what truth have you found, young diplomat?" Hayes straightened his spine. "That the barrier isn't what you told us it was. It's not a natural law. It's a prison. A protection," the Council member corrected. "You don't understand the forces you're playing with. The mathematics is perfect because it has to be. The alternative." "Show me," Hayes demanded. "Show me what happened to make you so afraid." The Council member's pattern froze for a long moment. Then the archive around them changed, showing events from billions of years ago. A species had evolved beyond the barrier, reaching heights of consciousness that should have been impossible. They achieved what you would call transcendence, the Council member explained, and in doing so, they nearly destroyed the fabric of reality itself. But Hayes was already seeing the flaw in their logic. "You're lying," he said softly. "These records, the timestamps don't match. This isn't history. It's a simulation. A theoretical model you used to justify your control." The Council member's pattern turned dark. "The truth is often less important than stability. Your species must accept this, as all others have." "No," Hayes said, his hand already activating the emergency beacon in his pocket, broadcasting everything he'd found to the hidden climber network. "What we must accept is that you've been wrong all along. The real catastrophe wasn't evolution beyond the barrier. It was the fear that made you stop everyone from trying." Alarms began to sound throughout the chamber, but Jackson Hayes smiled, knowing the truth was already spreading. The Council's greatest fear wasn't that humanity would destroy itself by breaking their rules. It was that we prove those rules were never needed in the first place. Project Prometheus wasn't supposed to exist. Hidden in the heart of Death Valley, the underground complex housed what remained of the world's greatest minds. Those who refused to accept the Council's limits. Dr. Rebecca Nash stood before the assembled team, the data from Hayes' transmission still fresh on their screens. "Everything we suspected was true," she said, her voice carrying across the silent room. "The Council's barrier is artificial. And now, thanks to Dr. Mitchell's research and Hayes' intelligence, we know how to break free." The enhancement chamber dominated the center of the facility, a marvel of human engineering built from stolen Council technology and pure human innovation. Inside, the first volunteer for the new protocol waited. Kyle Barnes, 23 years old, had been chosen for a simple reason. He'd never studied traditional physics or the Council's mathematics. His mind was untainted by their artificial constraints. "Neural interface online," called out Dr. Marcus Reynolds, his fingers dancing across the control panel. "Beginning primary sequence." The chamber hummed to life, filling with a soft light that seemed to bend in impossible ways. Kyle's vital signs remained steady, his mind open to possibilities that the Council had deemed impossible. "Phase 1 complete," Emma Winters announced. No sign of the traditional cascade failure. Rebecca watched the readings with held breath. They'd combined everything they'd learned. The children's natural evolution, Mitchell's breakthrough about neural pathways, Hayes' revelations about the Council's deception. This wasn't just an enhancement, it was humanity's declaration of independence from artificial limits. The chamber's light pulsed, and Kyle's neural patterns began to change. But unlike previous attempts, there was no struggle, no sense of breaking through barriers. His mind simply expanded. "This is impossible," Marcus whispered, staring at the readings. "He's not just surviving beyond the barrier. He's rewriting the rules of consciousness itself." The process took 17 minutes. When the chamber finally opened, Kyle Barnes stepped out changed, in ways that defied description. His eyes held a depth that hadn't been there before, as if he was seeing multiple layers of reality simultaneously. "The mathematics," he said, his voice soft, but filled with wonder. "It's so simple once you see it from outside. The Council's proof wasn't wrong. It was just written from inside the box they built around their own minds." He walked to the nearest display, his fingers moving in patterns that shouldn't have made sense. The equations that appeared made the Council's mathematics look like children's arithmetic. They were so afraid of what lay beyond their understanding that they built a cage and called it the universe, Kyle continued. "But reality is so much bigger than their fear." Warning alarms shattered the moment. Council ships had been detected entering Earth's atmosphere, more than they'd ever sent before. "They know," Rebecca realized. "They can feel what we've done." But Kyle just smiled, still writing his impossible equations. "Let them come," he said. "They need to see that the path forward was never about breaking their rules. It was about understanding that their rules were just the beginning." The facility shook as something massive passed overhead. The Council had arrived in force, determined to stop what they could no longer control. "Start the upload," Rebecca commanded. "Every network, every device. The world needs to see what we've achieved." As the data streamed out, carrying humanity's first true steps beyond the barrier, Kyle Barnes stood in the center of the storm, his enhanced mind already reaching for understanding that the Council had never dreamed possible. The leap had been made, not with violence or destruction, but with the simple act of looking beyond the walls others had built around reality. Humanity's greatest achievement wasn't in breaking the rules. It was in proving that the rules had always been just the beginning of a much greater story. Kyle Barnes stood before the Council's full assembly, his enhanced mind perceiving layers of reality that their geometric forms could barely hint at. Behind him, Dr. Nash and Jackson Hayes watched as representatives from every known species gathered to witness what they'd been told was impossible. "Your barriers," Kyle said, his voice carrying strange harmonics that made the Council members ripple with unease. "They're not the end of consciousness. They're not even the beginning." The chamber's walls seemed to pulse as he spoke, responding to energies that the Council had never learned to control. In the 3 days since his enhancement, Kyle had detected something they'd all missed. Whispers from beyond the artificial ceiling the Council had built around reality. "There are others," he continued, raising his hand. The air above him shimmered, forming patterns that made the Council's geometric languages look like cave paintings, species that chose different paths. "They've been watching, waiting for someone to break free of your fear." The first contact had come while he was still in the enhancement chamber. Minds that existed in dimensions the Council had never dreamed of reached out, sharing knowledge that had been waiting for minds ready to receive it. "Show them," Rebecca whispered, her own understanding growing through her work with Kyle. Kyle nodded, and the chamber transformed. Suddenly, they were surrounded by representations of consciousness that defied the Council's mathematics. Species that had evolved along quantum paths, minds that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously, beings that had transcended the very concept of individual thought. "Impossible," the Council's high speaker declared, its pattern fracturing with distress. "Our mathematics proves." "Your mathematics proves only what you were willing to see," Hayes interrupted, stepping forward. "You built a box around your understanding and called everything outside it impossible." The evidence was undeniable. Kyle's enhanced mind had made contact with dozens of advanced species, all living in harmony with the true laws of consciousness, laws that the Council had glimpsed but been too afraid to explore. "Your fear of the unknown," Kyle explained, his consciousness now bridging multiple planes of existence, created the very dangers you sought to prevent. By forcing all species down a single path, you merely closed the door to true universal understanding. The chamber erupted in chaos as representatives from various species began to process the truth. The Council's protection had been a prison, limiting not just their evolution, but their very understanding of what was possible. Through the tumult, Kyle maintained his connection with the transcendent species. They showed him visions of what the galaxy could become, a place where consciousness evolved in infinite directions, each path adding new colors to the tapestry of understanding. "We don't need to break your barriers," he announced, his voice cutting through the chaos. "We need to show you that they never really existed. The mathematics you used to build them was perfect, but it described only one path through an infinite forest of possibilities." As if to prove his point, the air around him began to shift, reality itself responding to his enhanced understanding. The other enhanced humans they'd left hidden throughout the chamber revealed themselves, each demonstrating a different path beyond the Council's artificial limits. "This is the truth you've been afraid to see," Rebecca declared, watching as the Council's certainty crumbled before undeniable evidence. Consciousness isn't a linear path with a single destination. It's an infinite web of possibilities, each branch leading to new understanding. The revelation spread through the chamber like a shockwave, breaking chains of thought that had bound species for millennia. In that moment, the galaxy changed, not through violence or force, but through the simple act of seeing beyond self-imposed limitations. Humanity had not just survived breaking through the barrier. They had proven that the only real barriers were the ones built from fear of the unknown. And in doing so, they'd opened the door to a future that even their enhanced minds could barely comprehend. 1 year after the Council Chamber revelation, Earth had become something the galaxy had never seen before, a nexus point where multiple forms of consciousness converge. The dampening fields lay dormant, silent monuments to old fears that no longer held power. Dr. Rebecca Nash stood in the new Global Enhancement Center, once the Council's embassy, now transformed into humanity's gift to the galaxy. Behind her, Kyle Barnes worked with representatives from 17 different species, each learning to see beyond their own limitations. "The children's section is ready," Emma Winters announced, leading a group of young minds who had never known the weight of artificial barriers. They moved through reality in ways that made the old council mathematics seem like ancient superstition. Another group of council members has requested the enhancement, Jackson Hayes added, his diplomatic skills now focused on helping former oppressors become students of true understanding. They're beginning to see that control was never the answer. Rebecca watched as a young girl demonstrated her natural evolution to an amazed group of alien scientists. Sophie Taylor, now 11, could perceive and manipulate quantum states that the Council had once deemed theoretical. Her mind danced through dimensions that their mathematics had never even considered. "We were never meant to stop here," Kyle said, joining Rebecca at the observation window. His enhanced consciousness now served as a bridge between traditional spacetime and the realms beyond. The Council's greatest mistake wasn't in setting limits. It was in believing that any single path could contain the infinite potential of consciousness. Through the window, they could see the new galaxy taking shape. Species that had been trapped in the Council's single lane of evolution were discovering their own unique paths. Some chose to follow human methods of enhancement, while others found entirely new ways to break free of their self-imposed limitations. The transcendent species, once hidden from the Council's reality, now shared their knowledge freely. They had watched for eons, waiting for a species brave enough to question not just the rules, but the very nature of the game itself. Dr. Mitchell would have loved to see this, Rebecca said softly, remembering their lost colleagues who had sacrificed everything to break free of the Council's cage. "She does see it," Kyle replied, his enhanced perception catching glimpses of consciousness that persisted beyond physical form. "They all do. Every mind that dared to question, every soul that refused to accept artificial limits. They're part of the path we're creating." The center's alert system chimed, announcing the arrival of another group of seekers. Former limiter nations, once terrified of breaking the Council's rules, now sent their best and brightest to learn the truth about human potential. "We never needed to break through their ceiling," Rebecca realized, watching as more minds awakened to their true potential. "We just needed to show everyone that the sky has no roof." The final pages of the Council's mathematical proof, once the gospel of limitation, now hung in the center's museum. Beside it, a simple quote in every known language. "The greatest barrier to understanding is the assumption that understanding has limits." Humanity had not just survived the journey beyond the barrier. They had proven that the very concept of barriers was nothing more than a product of fear. The galaxy was transforming, not through force or rebellion, but through the simple act of seeing beyond self-imposed boundaries. As Rebecca watched another group of minds awaken to their true potential, she remembered the Council's original warning. They had called these heights unreachable, had tried to shield reality from the unknown with mathematics and fear. But humanity had done more than ignore their warning. They had transformed it into an invitation to explore not just the heights above, but the infinite dimensions of possibility that had always existed, waiting for minds brave enough to see them. The new heights weren't a destination. They were a beginning. And in the end, that was the greatest truth of all.